2. The beginning of the revolution. The fall of absolutism. The capture of the Bastille. July 12, there were first clashes between the people and the troops. On July 13, the alarm sounded over the capital. Workers, artisans, small tradesmen, employees, students filled the squares and streets. The people began to arm themselves. Tens of thousands of rifles were captured. But in the hands of the government remained a formidable fortress, the prison of Bastille. The 8 towers of this fortress, surrounded by 2 deep moats, seemed an indestructible stronghold of absolutism. On the morning of July 14, crowds of people rushed to the walls of the Bastille. The commandant of the fortress gave the order to open fire. Despite the sacrifices, the people continued to advance. The ditches were overcome. The storm of the fortress began. Carpenters and roofers built forests. The artillerymen, who had crossed over to the people, opened fire and cut the chains of one of the lift bridges with cannonballs. The people broke into the fortress and seized the Bastille. The victorious uprising of July 14, 1789 was the beginning of the revolution. The king and the feudal party had to make concessions under the pressure of the popular masses. Necker returned to power. The king recognized the decisions of the National Assembly. These days in Paris, there was an organ of city government, the municipality, composed of representatives of the big bourgeoisie. The Bourgeois National Guard was formed. Commander of her became the Marquis of Lafayette, who created the popularity of participation in the War of the North American Colonies of England for independence. The fall of the Bastille made a great impression not only in France, but also far beyond its borders. In Russia, in England, in the German and Italian states, all progressive people enthusiastically welcomed the revolutionary events in Paris. Municipal revolution and peasant uprisings. The revolution spread swiftly throughout the country. On July 18, the insurrection began in Troyes, on the 19th in Strasbourg, on the 21st in Cherbourg, on the 24th in Rouen. In Strasbourg, the insurgent people were full master of the city for 2 days. Workers, armed with axes and hammers, broke open the doors of the town hall, and the people, bursting into the building, burned all the documents stored there. In Rouen and Cherbourg, local residents who went out into the street with exclamations, "Bread! Death to buyers!" forced to sell bread at a reduced price. In Troyes, the insurgent people seized their weapons and captured the town hall. In the provincial cities, the old authorities were abolished and elected municipalities were created. Quite often, royal officials and old city authorities, in fear of popular unrest, preferred to give up power without reserve to new, bourgeois municipalities. The news of the uprising in Paris, about the fall of the formidable Bastille, gave a powerful impetus to the peasant movement. The peasants armed themselves with pitchforks, sickles and chains, smashed the landed estates, burned down the feudal archives, seized and divided the landlords' meadows and forests. The Russian writer Karamzin, who traveled through Alsace in August 1789, wrote, "Everywhere in Alsace there is noticeable excitement. Entire villages are armed." The same was observed in other provinces. Peasant uprisings, which began in the center of the country, the Ile-de-France, spilling over in irresistible flow, at the end of July and in August, swept the whole country. In the province of Dauphin, out of every 5 noble castles, 3 were burned or destroyed. 40 castles were defeated in Franche-Comté. In Limousin, the peasants erected in front of the castle a single marchion of the gallows with the inscription, "Anyone who decides to pay rent to the landlord, as well as the landlord himself, if he decides to present such a demand, will be hanged." Fearless nobles threw their manors and fled to big cities from the raging peasant uprisings of the village. Peasant uprisings forced the Constituent Assembly to hasten to tackle the agrarian question. In the decisions adopted on August 4-11, 1789, the Constituent Assembly proclaimed that the feudal regime is completely destroyed. However, only so-called personal obligations and church tithes were abolished without compensation. Other feudal duties resulting from the holding of a land plot by a peasant were subject to redemption. The ransom was established in the interests not only of the nobility, but also of that part of the big bourgeoisie, which heavily bought up lands belonging to the nobility, and along with them acquired feudal rights. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, peasant uprisings and the municipal revolution in the cities expanded and consolidated the victory won by the people of Paris on July 14, 1789. The power in the country actually passed into the hands of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie dominated the municipalities of Paris and other French cities. The armed strength of the revolution, the National Guard, was under her leadership. In the Constituent Assembly, domination also belonged to the bourgeoisie and the liberal nobility that joined it. The bourgeoisie was then a revolutionary class. She fought against the feudal absolutist system and sought to destroy it. The ideologists of the bourgeoisie, who headed the Third Estate, identified the social ideals of their class with the interests of the entire French nation and even of all mankind. August 26, 1789, the Constituent Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, the most important document of the French Revolution, which had a world historical significance. People are born and remain free and equal in rights, the declaration said. This revolutionary principle was proclaimed at a time when, in most of the world, man was still a slave, a thing when in the Russian Empire and other feudal absolutist states there were millions of serfs, and in the colonies of bourgeois aristocratic England and the United States of America, slave trade. The principles proclaimed by the Declaration were a bold, revolutionary challenge to the old, feudal world. By natural, sacred, inalienable human and citizen rights, the Declaration declared the freedom of the individual, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, the right to resist oppression. Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Poster. In an era when feudal absolutist order still dominated almost throughout Europe, the bourgeois democratic, anti-feudal principles of the Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights played a great progressive role. They made a tremendous impression on contemporaries and left a deep imprint on the public consciousness of the peoples. However, by the same sacred and inviolable right, the Declaration declared the right of ownership. True, this was also the element of the progressive, the protection of bourgeois property from attempts by the feudal absolutist system. But above all, property rights were turned against the poor. His proclamation in fact created the best conditions for a new form of exploitation of man by man, for the capitalist exploitation of the working people. A sharp discrepancy between the humanistic principles, the broad democratic promises of the Declaration and the real policy of the Constituent Assembly was revealed very soon. In the Constituent Assembly the leading role was played by the party of constitutionalists, expressing the interests of the upper middle class and the liberal nobility. The leaders of this party, the brilliant orator, the flexible and two-faced political businessman Count Mirabeau, the secretive and quirky abbot of Sieyes and others, enjoyed great influence and popularity in the Constituent Assembly. They were supporters of constitutional monarchy and limited reforms, which were supposed to consolidate the rule of the big bourgeoisie. Having risen to power on the crest of a popular uprising, the big bourgeoisie immediately discovered its desire to prevent deep democratic transformations. 5 days after the Constituent Assembly enthusiastically adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, it began to discuss a draft law on the electoral system. According to the law approved by the Assembly, citizens were divided into active and passive. Citizens who did not possess property qualifications were declared passive. They were deprived of the right to choose and to be elected. Active citizens were those who had the established qualification. They were granted voting rights. In direct contradiction with the principle of equality proclaimed in the Declaration, the bourgeoisie tried to legitimize its domination and leave the working people politically disenfranchised. Public speech 5-6 October. The king and the court party were by no means inclined to put up with the gains of the revolution and were actively preparing for a counter-revolutionary coup. The king did not affirm the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen in the August decrees on the abolition of feudal rights. In September, new troops were called to Versailles. On October 1st, a counter-revolutionary demonstration of reactionary officers took place in the royal palace. All this testified to the intention of the king and his entourage to disperse the Constituent Assembly and with the help of military force to suppress the revolution. In the autumn of 1789, the food situation in Paris again sharply deteriorated. The poor were starving. In the broad masses of the working people of the capital, especially among women, who were idle in the queues for bread, dissatisfaction grew. It was also intensified under the influence of persistent rumors of counter-revolutionary preparations of the court. On October 5, huge crowds of people moved to Versailles. The people surrounded the royal palace, and at dawn on October 6 rushed there. The king was compelled not only to approve all decisions of the Constituent Assembly, but also, at the request of the people, to move with his family to Paris. Following the king, the Constituent Assembly also held its meetings there. This new revolutionary action by the people of Paris, as in the July days, frustrated the counter-revolutionary plans of the court and prevented the dispersal of the Constituent Assembly. The king, after moving to the capital, was under vigilant supervision of the masses and could no longer openly resist revolutionary changes. The Constituent Assembly was able to continue its work unhindered and carry out further bourgeois reforms. Confiscation of church lands. The bourgeois legislation of the Constituent Assembly. In November 1789, the Constituent Assembly, in order to liquidate the financial crisis and break the power of the church, which was an important pillar of the feudal system, decided to confiscate church lands, declare them national property and put it on the market. At the same time, a resolution was adopted on the issue of so-called banknotes, state monetary obligations, the value of which was ensured by income from the sale of church lands. The designates intended to pay the national debt, but later they turned into ordinary paper money. Clergy before and after the loss of their possessions. A satirical leaflet. In May 1790, the order of selling national property in small plots with installment payments up to 12 years was legalized. However, soon the fragmentation of land was cancelled, and installment was reduced to 4 years. Under these conditions only well-to-do peasants had the opportunity to acquire church lands. However, the laws adopted in March and May 1790, the Constituent Assembly established very difficult conditions for the peasants to purchase feudal obligations. The peasantry openly expressed its discontent with the policy of the bourgeois Constituent Assembly and again took the road of struggle. In the autumn of 1790, peasant unrest began again, the landed estates flamed up. In many places, peasants, attacking castles and manors, burned all archival documents and stopped feudal payments. Quite often the peasants of adjacent villages agreed among themselves that no one should pay land tax and that the one who pays it will be hanged. The Constituent Assembly sent troops, National Guards, emergency commissioners to the provinces covered by the peasant movement. But all attempts to extinguish the fire of peasant uprisings were in vain. In the years 1789–1791, the Constituent Assembly carried out a number of other reforms that affirmed in France the foundations of the bourgeois social order. It abolished class division, hereditary titles of the nobility, withdrew from the conduct of the clergy registration of acts of birth, marriage, death, placed the church and its ministers under state control. Instead of the former medieval administrative system, France was divided into 83 departments, shops were abolished, government regulation of industrial production was abolished, internal customs duties and other restrictions that hampered the development of industry and trade were abolished. All these transformations, which had a historically progressive character, corresponded to the interests of the bourgeoisie and were called upon to provide favorable conditions for the development of its trade and industrial activities. At the same time, the Constituent Assembly adopted laws specifically directed against workers. So, shortly after the events of October 5-6, 1789, a law was passed permitting the use of military force to suppress popular uprisings. Work movement. The Le Chapelle Law. The class essence of the policy of the bourgeois Constituent Assembly manifested itself even more clearly in the persecution of the workers' movement. In France at the end of the XVIIIth century, there was no large-scale machine industry and, consequently, there was not yet a factory proletariat. However, there were numerous categories of wage workers, workers in centralized and scattered manufactories, craft apprentices and pupils, construction workers, port workers, laborers, etc. Some groups of workers, especially those from the village, were still connected with land or other property, and for their work on hiring was often only an auxiliary occupation. But for an increasing number of workers wage labor became the main source of existence. Workers were already a significant part of the population of large cities. In Paris, by the time of the Revolution, there were up to 300,000 workers with their families. The workers were in a powerless position and entirely dependent on the owners. Wages were low and lagged behind price increases. A 14-18-hour day was common even for skilled workers. The scourge for the workers was unemployment, which was especially aggravated on the eve of the Revolution as a result of the trade and industrial crisis. Work in Paris continued unrest. In August 1789 about 3,000 workers in tailoring workshops staged a demonstration, demanding an increase in wages. Demonstrators dispersed the detachment of the National Guard. There were unrest among the unemployed who worked in the municipal work organized by the municipality. The workers threatened even to burn the town hall. In the years 1790–1791, workers' organizations were formed, partly related to their origin with pre-revolutionary companions, but basically they were alliances of a new, professional type. The most active at that time were typographic workers, more literate and class-conscious than other categories of workers. In 1790, the first printing house organization appeared in Paris, the Printing Assembly, which developed a special regulation adopted by the General Meeting of Workers' Representatives. He provided, in particular, the organization of mutual assistance in case of illness and old age. In the autumn of the same year, a more developed and formalized organization of printing workers was founded, the Typographic and Philanthropic Club. This club began to publish its own printed organ. He organized a mutual aid business among the workers and led their struggle against entrepreneurs. Similar associations of printing workers arose in other cities. Such developed professional organizations as the Typographic Club were then an exception. But the workers of other professions tried to create their associations. So, for example, there was a Fraternal Union of Carpenters, which included many thousands of workers. In the spring of 1791, major strikes took place in Paris. Most actively participated in them typographical workers and carpenters, as more organized, but also strikers and workers of other professions, blacksmiths, locksmiths, carpenters, shoemakers, masons, roofers, up to 80,000 people. The strike movement, led by the workers' organizations, the Typographic Club, the Brotherly Union of Carpenters, etc., caused great alarm among the owners. They hastened to appeal first to the Parisian municipality, and then directly to the Constituent Assembly, demanding that they take decisive measures against the strikers. The Constituent Assembly met the employers' petitions and, on the proposal of the Deputy Le Chapelle, issued on June 14, 1791, a decree forbidding workers to join unions and carry out strikes under pain of fines and imprisonment. 2 days later, on June 16, the Constituent Assembly decided to close the charity workshops, organized in 1789 for the unemployed. The authorities carefully monitored the implementation of the law of Le Chapelier. Strict penalties were applied for violating it. Marx wrote that this law was squeezed by state police measures to compete between capital and labor in a framework that was convenient for capital. K. Marx, Capital, Volume 1, M. 1955, p. 745. Constitution of 1791. In 1791 the Constituent Assembly completed the drafting of the Constitution. France was proclaimed a constitutional monarchy. The supreme executive power was granted to the king, the supreme legislative power to the Legislative Assembly. Only so-called active citizens could participate in the elections, making up less than 20% of the population. The Constitution did not abolish slavery that existed in the colonies. Compared with the state legal system of the feudal absolutist system, the Constitution of 1791 was progressive. But it clearly revealed the class nature of the victorious bourgeoisie. The drafters of the Constitution tried to perpetuate not only the property inequality of people, but also, in direct contradiction to the Declaration of 1789, the political inequality of citizens. The anti-democratic policy of the Constituent Assembly caused an ever more sharp discontent among the people. The peasants, workers, artisans, small proprietors remained unmet in their social and political demands. The revolution did not give them what they expected of it. In the Constituent Assembly, the interests of the democratic circles were represented by a group of deputies headed by a lawyer from Arras, Maximilien Robespierre, 1758–1794, a convinced, adamant supporter of democracy, whose voice was increasingly heard in the country. Clubs and people's societies. Democratic movement in 1789–1791 years. During the years of the Revolution, the political activity of the masses has greatly increased. In Paris, the most important role played by the local government, the districts, later converted into sections. They often held meetings, which became a genuine political school for the capital's population. The leaders of the bourgeois municipality sought to destroy the continuity of meetings of districts and sections and turn them only into electoral assemblies, very rarely convened, but the democratic elements in every way resisted it. Various political clubs emerged in the capital and in the provincial cities. The greatest influence was the Jacobin Club and the Cordelier Club. They were called by the name of the monasteries, in the premises of which they gathered. The official name of the Jacobin Club was the Society of Friends of the Constitution, and the Cordelier Club was the Society of Friends of Human and Citizens' Rights. The composition of the Jacobin Club in 1789–1791 was rather variegated. The club united bourgeois politicians of various shades, from Mirabeau to Robespierre. The Cordelier Club, which arose in April 1790, served as a political center for ordinary people who took an active part in the events of the Revolution. In its composition there were many passive citizens. In its sessions women as well participated. Among the figures of this club stood out the brilliant speaker Georges Danton, 1759–1794, and the talented journalist Camille Desmoulins. From the rostrum of the Cordelier Club, there was a sharp criticism of the anti-democratic policies of the Constituent Assembly and the censorship constitution of 1791. In the Social Club and the broad organization, the World Federation of Friends of Truth, created by him, social demands were brought to the forefront. The club published the newspaper, Iron Mouth. The organizers of the social club were the Abbé Claude Fauché and the journalist Anne Bonville. The newspaper, The Friend of the People, published by Marat, had a huge influence on the revolutionary democratic movement. The doctor and scientist, Jean-Paul Marat, 1743–1793, from the first days of the revolution gave himself entirely to the revolutionary struggle. An unshakable advocate of the interests and rights of the people, a friend of the poor, a revolutionary democrat, a courageous freedom fighter. Marat passionately hated tyranny and oppression. He, before others, guessed that the feudal oppression was replaced by the oppression of the aristocracy of wealth. On the pages of his genuinely popular newspaper and in his war pamphlets, Marat exposed the counter-revolutionary plans and actions of the court, the anti-popular policy of Necker, the propensity to betray the leaders of the Constitutionalist Party, Mirabeau, Lafayette, etc., who lulled the vigilance of the people with phrases about brotherhood, about trust. Marat taught revolutionary determination, urged the people not to stop halfway, to go to the end, to the complete destruction of the enemies of the revolution. The court, the nobility, the big bourgeoisie hated Marat, persecuted him. The sympathy and support of the people allowed Marat to continue from the underground, where he often had to hide, the struggle for the cause of revolutionary democracy. The Varennes crisis. The king and his entourage, unable to act openly, secretly prepared a counter-revolutionary coup. From the first days of the revolution began the flight of the French aristocracy abroad. In Turin, and then in Koblenz, a center of counter-revolutionary emigration was created, which maintained close ties with the absolutist governments of Europe. In the émigré environment, plans for the intervention of foreign powers against revolutionary France were discussed. Louis XVI maintained through secret agents a connection with emigrants and European courts. In secret letters addressed to the Spanish king and other European monarchs, he renounced everything that he had to do after the outbreak of the revolution. He pre-authorized everything that his commissioners deemed necessary to take to restore his legitimate authority. In the morning of June 21, 1791, Paris was awakened by the roar of the alarm. The alarm was announcing an extraordinary message. The king and the queen fled. Resentment embraced the people. In the face of obvious treason, fraught with dangerous consequences for the revolution, the masses began to arm themselves. The flight of the king was part of a long-prepared and carefully thought-out plot. The king was to flee to the border fortress of Montmédy, where troops were stationed under the command of the ardent monarchist Marquis de Bouillot, and from there headed the counter-revolutionary troops to Paris, disperse the assembly and restore the feudal absolutist regime. The conspirators also expected that the flight of the king from Paris would induce foreign powers to intervene in order to restore the old order in France. However, when the king's carriage was not far from the border, the postal superintendent Drouet identified Louis XVI, who was disguised as a lackey, and, having raised the local population to his feet, rushed after him. In the town of Varennes, the king and queen were detained and taken into custody by armed peasants. Accompanied by an innumerable crowd of armed men, the king and queen, as prisoners of the people, were returned to Paris. Obvious for all, the betrayal of the king gave rise to an acute political crisis. The Cordeliers Club led the movement of the masses, who insisted on the renunciation of the traitor king from power. The demand of the Republic, with which the Cordeliers acted earlier, has now gained many supporters not only in the capital, but also in the provinces. This requirement was exhibited by local clubs in Strasbourg, Clermont-Ferrand, and in several other cities. The struggle of the peasantry against the feudal system again intensified in the countryside. In the border departments, the peasants began to create volunteer battalions. Standing in power, the big bourgeoisie did not want However, to abolish the monarchical regime, trying to save and rehabilitate the monarchy, the constituent corruption made a decision supporting a false version of the abduction of the king. Cordeliers launched agitation against this policy of the assembly. The Jacobin Club split. The revolutionary democratic part of it supported the Cordeliers. The right-wing part of the club, the Constitutionalists, on July 16 withdrew from its structure and created a new club, the Club of the Feuillants, which was also named after the monastery in which its meetings took place. On July 17, at the call of the Cordelier Club, many thousands of Parisians, mostly workers and artisans, gathered in the Champ de Mars to sign their petitions demanding the deposition of the king and bringing him to justice. Against a peaceful people's demonstration, the National Guard was led by Lafayette. The National Guard opened fire. Several hundred wounded and many dead remained on the Champ de Mars. The shooting of July 17, 1791, meant an open transition of the big monarchist bourgeoisie to counter-revolutionary positions. Legislative Assembly. At the end of September 1791, having exhausted its powers, the Constituent Assembly dispersed. On October 1 of the same year, the Legislative Assembly, elected on the basis of the census electoral system, was opened. The right part of the Legislative Assembly was made up of the Feuillants, the party of large financiers and merchants, ship owners, slave traders and planters, owners of mines and large landowners, industrialists associated with the production of luxury goods. This part of the big bourgeoisie and the liberal nobility that joined it were interested in preserving a monarchy and the Constitution of 1791. Relying on the numerous group of deputies of the Centre, the first-time fellows played a leading role in the Legislative Assembly. The left part of the meeting was composed of deputies associated with the Jacobin Club. Soon they split into two groups. One of them was called the Girondins. The most prominent deputies of this party were elected in the department of the Gironde. The Girondists represented the commercial and industrial and new land-owning bourgeoisie, mainly the southern, southwestern and southeastern departments, interested in the radical bourgeois reorganization of society. They were more radical than the females. At first they also supported the Constitution of 1791, but later moved to the Republican positions and became bourgeois Republicans. The most prominent Girondists were journalists Brisset and Verne. In the Jacobin Club, the policy of the Girondins was criticized by Robespierre and other figures representing the interests of the most democratic sections of France at that time. They were supported by the extremely left group of deputies in the Legislative Assembly. These deputies were called Montagnards, since in the Legislative Assembly, and later in the Convention, they occupied seats on the highest benches in the conference hall, on the mountain in French, the mountain, la montagne. Over time, the term Montagnards became identified with the term Jacobins. The Girondins and the Montagnards first acted jointly against the counter-revolutionary party of the court and against the ruling party of the Feuillants, but later disagreements began between the Girondins and the Montagnards, who went into open struggle. The political situation in the country at the beginning of 1792. In 1792, France's economic situation deteriorated. The trade and industrial crisis, which was somewhat weakened in 1790-1791, again worsened. The industries that previously worked in the yard and the aristocracy, as well as for export, shrank at a particularly rapid rate. Almost completely ceased production of luxury goods. Unemployment was growing. After the uprising of Negro slaves that broke out in August 1791 on the island of San Domingo, Haiti, colonial goods, sugar, coffee, tea, disappeared from sale. Prices for other food products also increased. In January 1792 in Paris began major unrest on the basis of high prices and food deprivation. In Bordeaux in the spring of 1792, a strike of carpenters and bakers took place. Workers fought for higher wages due to rising cost of living. Legislative coordination received numerous petitions from workers and the poor demanding the establishment of firm prices for food and curbing speculators. Worried and the rural poor. In some areas of France, armed detachments of starving peasants seized and divided grain among themselves, forcibly established the sale of bread and other products at firm prices. The main issue of the revolution, the agrarian, remained unresolved. The peasants sought to achieve the destruction of all feudal duties without ransom. Since the end of 1791, agrarian disturbances have intensified again. At the same time, the counter-revolutionary forces that fought for the restoration of the feudal absolutist system became more active. In the South, aristocrats, as the supporters of feudalism were then called, tried to raise the counter-revolutionary insurgency. Intensified counter-revolutionary agitation was led by the Catholic clergy, a large part of which refused to swear a new constitution and recognize new orders. The royal court and other counter-revolutionary forces, preparing for a decisive blow against the revolution, now made the main bet on the armed intervention of foreign powers.